Education is a funny thing, especially liberal education. The education where you're reading and writing about and looking at things. Um, we often ask ourselves jokingly, what do we get out? What do we remember from our educations? Um, Part of your education, if you're in a sort of practical program, if you're going to pharmacy school or you're going to be a nurse or an accountant or you're getting a business degree, the emphasis is on practical skills. This is not that class, obviously. This is part of your liberal arts requirement, your humanities requirement, you might say, I guess. So, what are you supposed to get out of it? I mean, in a certain respect, what you get out of it are references. That is, most people sort of we all have to make our way in the world in sense of understanding it. Politics, history, science, nature, human relationships. Every human being has to sort of negotiate the world in that respect. One of the differences between an educated person and a person who hasn't been able to get an education is that the educated person has certain references. Certain knowledge of what the great minds of the past have said about the things that they're encountering, um, about the aspects of human existence that we all go through. I mean, the truth is that human civilization has been around for thousands of years, and during that period, there have been great minds, geniuses, who have written about these subjects. So I would say one of the advantages of being an educated person, and that just means having the luck to get an education, and especially the luck and the privilege of part of that education not being completely practical, in terms of like job related, but actually having the leisure to look at great works of literature, philosophy, religion, science, just for their own sake, you might say. But one of the great advantages is that you're not going in blind to life. You have these references to make use of in a completely free way. But you have references. And what I've done here is collected some of the most famous and maybe a little less famous, but equally striking quotes from almost all. I think I left out Dante, but almost all of what we'll read. And in a certain respect, in 10 years, if you remember anything from these books or from this course, it'll be these mottos or these famous things or something similar. Um, so I would say that is one reason to read these books. Now you might say, well, why don't we just remember the mottos? Why don't we just remember these quotes? Why do we have to go through 3 months? Well, it's one thing to remember the quotes or be familiar with the quotes. It's another thing to know what their context is. For instance, I'm a philosophy teacher, and um, my normal life, and so when I hear people quote Descartes, "I think, therefore I am," which is something that most people know. Um, that's great that people know that, but they usually use it in a completely sort of screwed up way because they don't know the context in Descartes, like why he actually said that, what was the actual issue that he was dealing with. Some people do, some people don't, but it's a great advantage to have a grasp of what the origin of these things were, as well as what they say. So what I've collected here, in my joking way, calling this the greatest hits of Western social thought, are some of the most striking and important and famous and influential parts of, just to give you a taste of what we'll be doing. And I would say, these things are really incredible, these things that these authors have said. Something as famous as, say, Machiavelli here, it is better to be feared than loved. That's something a lot of people know. Um, but you'll know it coming out of, I think, chapter 15 of Machiavelli's The Prince, and what the context was and why he would say such a thing. And you'll have a more nuanced view of Machiavelli himself, who was not all bad, certainly. And and therefore have a more nuanced grasp of what he meant when he said that. Aristotle, man is by nature a political animal. That is something that people tend to quote without really knowing the context. And that really, you will know what he means by political or political animal, which is quite different from what it might appear at first. The quote from Hobbes's Leviathan is fantastic. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's very, very famous little end point there. The ending of that, nasty, brutish, and short. The context of that is pretty amazing. It's Hobbes's description of what human beings are like in the so-called state of nature when they have no governmental power to rule them and therefore restrain their selfishness and their brutality, and life becomes a living hell. It's a pretty interesting and extreme, I would say, condemnation of what raw human nature actually is. And you'll see it's an argument for the need for strong government, let's say, as opposed to his successor, John Locke, who said the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it. Locke being much more moderate and much more positive about what human beings were actually like, and really a kind of a response to Hobbes. Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau are what we call the liberals, modern liberalism, arguing for really what we consider to be the modern form of government, of at least some form of democratic government where the people have some say. Locke thought that human nature had a law of nature, which he called reason, and that government was not an absolute necessity, although it turned out to be the most convenient thing for people to do, to form governments. And then the Frenchman Rousseau, his famous "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains," which is really such an important milestone in social thought. The recognition that human beings need to be free, first of all, but that they're not. And Rousseau thinking that he can provide a solution to that. Moving on, you can see we're moving historically here to the great American founding governmental documents, We the People, the opening of the Constitution, and we hold these truths to be self-evident, which are these brilliant sort of moves that the composers of these documents made. The preamble to the Constitution, something simple as "We the People." The voice of that document is the actual people of the United States, who are the only ones who have the authority to actually institute a government. It's really quite a reminder of what democracy actually is. And in the somewhat earlier document, Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, which is just such another incredible move. These are obviously very famous things in American history. If you're an American, you know them. If you're not an American, you might have heard of them and realize how important Americans hold these documents. The idea that they're self-evident truths that can be relied upon to establish political communities really is quite something. As we move through things, the great Kant, from What is Enlightenment? Nothing is required for this enlightenment, however, except freedom. It's a pretty amazing document from 18th century about how societies are inexorably moving towards being more and more enlightened. But what do they need? They need freedom of speech. Declaration on the Universal Rights of Man, this great document that came out of the French Revolution, which expresses something which I think is a very, very influential thought, and something that is very representative or very characteristic of the modern way of thinking. Liberty consists of doing anything which does not harm others, which is such a strong thought, I think, in modern people. So again, they should have their freedom to do whatever the heck they want with their lives, acting, believing, as long as it doesn't harm others. It's no one else's business, which is such a departure from previous ways of thinking about the place of the individual within the community. Very famous quote from the end of the Communist Manifesto and Marx and Engels: "Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." I mean, that's just such a famous reference, such a maybe the most famous revolutionary slogan ever. And then moving to the 20th century, the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who said in Souls of Black Folk, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, which is really quite an amazing thing to say, beginning of the 20th century, to say that this will be the problem of Western societies, maybe of all societies, is the problem of racism and how people of different ethnicities and races will deal with each other. It's just, he was right, I think. And moving back a little bit to Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, to account for and excuse the tyranny of man, many ingenious arguments have been brought forward. Just an amazing document from the 18th century, which you'll read parts of, in which she basically comes out and says that in human history and in her own society, men tyrannize over women. Men are tyrants in that respect, insofar as they tyrannize over women. Really incredible statement to make at the time, and no doubt true, right? And then finally, from a little known work by John Addington Symonds, Society Lies Under the Spell of Ancient Terrorism and Coagulated Errors. It's quite an amazing book that I've discovered last year. I mean, it's not very well known, but it's becoming more well known. And that is A Problem in Modern Ethics, written in the 1890s by Symonds, an Englishman who more or less considered now to have been a gay man, but that was just such a difficult thing to determine in those days, because the word gay or even the word homosexual had not yet been formulated, really. Society lies under the spell of ancient terrorism and coagulated errors. Basically, society is homophobic. He's talking about homophobia. He's talking about the prejudice against and the persecution of gay men. The book is really about gay men. It's not about gay women. That would come later, I suppose. But it was, which is unfortunate but that's really all he knew. But it's unfortunate because it would be nice to see a larger view, which is essentially an argument for gay rights from the 1890s, if you can believe it. It's really groundbreaking work. But the book is really a defense of being gay, a defense of homosexuality as not any form of deviance or something unnatural, and that gay men should be protected. Gay people in general, I suppose, by implication, should be protected and not persecuted. Really, quite an amazing work. So what are these? These are references, man. I mean, I think that going through the works, or at least excerpts, parts of the works that produce these amazing statements, and then having them in your mind, or at least in the back of your mind, as things you can refer to, is really, a great thing. I mean, what is any class in the humanities about? It's about a teacher trying to pass on something they think has been of value in their own education to their students. And I suppose having at least some of these things at your command for reference, I believe is a great thing, and maybe one of the justifications for there being a class like this.